This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's what I normally do in this series. From time to time, I like to look at the opposite end of the spectrum, and instead take a look at some of the worst cards we've ever seen, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst Orzhov cards in the game's history. While these videos don't use empirical data to rank the cards and are at least based in part on my opinion, there is some data that I use to help me make these lists. For a card to be considered bad, for example, it can't have ever top 8'd at a premier level event, nor can it be widely played in EDH. Most of these cards on this list are bad filler or worse and limited too. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have an Orzhov color identity. That means that both the black and white mana symbol had to appear somewhere on the card with no other colored mana symbols, and that can just mean casting cost, but it can also mean a card that is black with a white activated ability, and so on. In all, there are 245 cards with an Orzhov color identity, and in this video I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst ones ever. At number 10, I have Righteous War. Protection can be a pretty nice thing to have, for sure. After all, it can make creatures unblockable, immune to damage, and untargetable in many situations. But Righteous War is far too specific about how it distributes that protection. Giving protection from white to black creatures and protection from black to white creatures is just odd. This is especially true because if you're playing Righteous War, you're probably a black-white deck to begin with, and this means that you will end up being unable to target your own creatures with some of your cards. And while you can definitely build your deck with that in mind, you don't really want to be building your deck around Righteous War to begin with, because the protection is just irrelevant against too many decks. At best, this is a sideboard card, but it has never been sideboarded in any successful deck in the game's incredibly long history, and that's because if you're interested in protection from a specific color, there are much better ways to do it. But hey, at least it has some pretty cool old-school Magic art. At number 9, I have Purge the Profane. Mind Rot already isn't a very good card, so making it cost 1 more mana in exchange for gaining 2 life really isn't worth it. There are a few things that make this kind of discard spell bad. If you're not going to have any real impact on the board and you're spending 4 mana, you need to be doing something big, but this just won't most of the time. A card like Purge the Profane will make your opponent discard their 2 worst cards in the early game, and by the late game, they may not have any cards at all, making it a miserable card to draw. It is really only the mid-game where a card like this can shine, and even then it's not that great, but your opponent will more frequently have some interesting stuff for you to hit. That's a pretty narrow window for it to just be mediocre. At number 8, I have Revenant Patriarch. I think that, at first glance, this card seems pretty cool. A 5-mana 4/3 that makes your opponent skip their next combat is a pretty unique card. However, making your opponent skip combat once really isn't that great. Your opponent still gets their whole turn, and they can add more to the board even if they can't attack. Additionally, their creatures will also be able to block on your next turn, so it won't always really help you out in a race. There are also plenty of times where the Patriarch's Enter the Battlefield ability just won't matter. Your opponent wasn't going to attack anyway. So what you often end up with here is a 5-mana 4/3 that can't block who has a pretty mediocre Enter the Battlefield ability, and it isn't enough to overcome the cost of the card and its bad stats. And yeah, sometimes this will actually line up pretty well in very specific situations, but that just won't happen often enough. You can't even rebuy the ability over and over again with blink and flicker effects. It would be cool if you could. You can't though, because he only does that if you cast him with white mana, and obviously if you are blinking or flickering him, you aren't paying mana to cast the Patriarch. At number 7, it is Unyielding Krumar, which is not only bad, but also boring. A 4-mana 3/3 doesn't do well on the vanilla test these days, so you have to do something sweet to overcome that, and 1 and a white to gain first strike until end of turn isn't it. At number 6, it's Executioner's Swing. Orzhov gets some of the most powerful removal spells around. Think cards like Vindicate and Anguished Unmaking, but Executioner's Swing definitely doesn't live up to that reputation. It does only cost 2 mana, which is nice, but the requirement that a creature has to be damaged holds it back a ton. This is because in order to do damage to a creature, you have to expend some type of resource in most cases, whether it's a spell, activated ability, or a block that does the damage. This ends up being a pretty big hoop to jump through, especially because it won't even outright kill everything. At number 5, I have Mournful Zombie. A 3-mana 2/1 is a terrible starting point. I mean, those stats are worse than Grey Ogre, which isn't exactly a paragon of efficiency to begin with. And yeah, adding a weak activated ability to the card doesn't save it. I mean, even if it could just tap to gain 1 life, it wouldn't be good, so having to pay 1 white for it is rough. Sure, it is a repeatable source of life gain, so maybe this Mournful Zombie is better if you're playing a deck with a lot of triggers that pay you off for gaining life, but there are countless other cards that give you repeatable life gain for a lot less. So yeah, Mournful Zombie is just terrible. No wonder he's so sad. At number 4, I have Moratorium Stone. So the stone lets you hate on graveyards, making it so you can exile a card for 2 mana. Hating on graveyards is important in many formats, but there are just so many better ways to do it. Obviously, the second ability here is all but useless in EDH, as it is a singleton format. And that has something to do with the fact that it's only in 8 of the 136,000 plus decks on EDH Rec. However, the ability wasn't good enough for constructed formats either, where you might imagine that it would do some work, but that wasn't really the case. The second ability is almost completely useless until your opponent has a non-land permanent in their graveyard with the same name as one of the permanents they have in play. Once that happens, it's kind of cool that you can go after the card in the graveyard to get rid of the card in play, but expecting that to line up for you is a really bad idea, and most of the time, Moratorium Stone just ends up being a really bad graveyard hate card. At number 3, I have Conjurer's Ban. Cards that let you name a card and then keep your opponent from playing it can be good, but usually only when they last more than a single turn, and usually only when they're attached to a card that does something else, like Meddling Mage. Conjurer's Ban is a 1-turn version of that effect, and even though it replaces itself, it isn't worth it. It is incredibly hard to accurately know what to name with a card like this, especially because the card does nothing if you pick the incorrect name, and really it can do nothing even if you do pick the correct name because your opponent probably has something else they can do. With Meddling Mage and the like, even if your opponent doesn't have the card on their next turn, you still get to blank future copies of that card when they draw them, and that's not the case here. This also means that you can more effectively disrupt combos with a card like Meddling Mage instead of just delaying the inevitable with Conjurer's Ban. And yeah, I think some people will see a card like this and say, well, it's basically a 2-mana draw 1 spell with minor upside. Is it really that bad? And the answer is, yeah. You have to look at the cost of playing this card in your deck in the first place. Even if it does replace itself, you could just be running literally thousands of cards that are better. At number 2, it is Vectis Dominator. Master Decoy type creatures tend to be pretty nice, at least in limited. Tapping down the opponent's best blocker or attacker to make the situation better for you is a pretty big deal and almost feels like removal sometimes. However, Vectis Dominator is a really terrible version of that type of effect. Sure, you don't have to pay any mana for it, but the problem is the choice it gives your opponent. It's tempting to look at this as a pick your poison type effect, where you get something good no matter what your opponent chooses, but it doesn't play out that way very often. One of the two options will usually have a very minimal effect on your opponent, and they'll just choose whichever one that's true about. In that situation, which is pretty common, Vectis Dominator is basically a blank card. Sometimes you will be able to make this feel like a pick your poison effect, but it takes a very specific game state for that to happen. And at number 1, I have Martyr's Tomb. This 4-mana enchantment can prevent damage done to your creatures, 1 damage at a time, and it doesn't even cost mana to do it. Of course, you do have to pay life, and 2 life to prevent 1 damage done to a creature is a bad exchange rate. Heck, even though the activated ability doesn't actually cost mana, you have to remember that this costs 4 to cast in the first place, so you're actually paying 4 mana and 8 life to prevent the first 4 damage, for example, and that's not so good. Sure, sometimes this can help save a creature, and it can really be a thorn in the side of your opponent, but it just isn't impactful enough to ever make the cost of mana and life worth it. Well, those are my picks for the worst Orzhov cards in the history of Magic. If you want to own any of these because, I don't know, maybe you like collecting terrible cards, you can find a direct link to the Card Kingdom store for each individual card in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too, and if you want to make sure you stay aware of future content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to see more MTG Top 10s, including more on worst cards, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you like hearing me talk about Magic, consider subscribing to my other YouTube channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.